In 1887 Massachusetts, 28-year-old Catherine Morris stood at the train station clutching a worn carpet bag, watching her breath form clouds in the bitter February air. The auction block behind her still bore the chalk marks where her aunt had written, "Spinster, good for household work," in letters large enough for every bidder to see. At an age when society declared her worthless for marriage and childbearing, Catherine had become nothing more than livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron wheels of the departing train grew smaller in the distance, carrying away the last remnants of the life she had known. What she didn't know was that Marcus Wellington, a widowed father struggling to care for 8 children on a remote timber farm, had just made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the people society throws away are exactly what broken families need to become whole again. Catherine's bare feet pressed against the cold wooden floor of the auction house as her aunt's sharp voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Step forward, Catherine. Let them see what they're bidding on." The year 1887 had brought nothing but shame to the Morris family name in Millbrook, Massachusetts. Catherine knew she was the biggest shame of all. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the small cloth bundle containing everything she owned. Through the dusty windows, she could see men gathering in the courtyard, their voices mixing with the February wind as they discussed her like a piece of machinery they might purchase for their homes. "She's strong enough for farm work," one man called out, his boots echoing on the cobblestones. "But what's wrong with her that she's never married?" Aunt Gertrude spat into the dirt beside the platform. "Nothing wrong except she's particular, too particular for her own good. 28 years old and never gave a man so much as a second glance. Doctor says she's healthy, but what good is healthy when a woman's past her prime?" The autumn of Catherine's youth had passed without the marriage proposals that came to other girls. Now, in the harsh winter of societal judgment, she understood that unmarried women approaching 30 were considered burdens, failures, cautionary tales whispered about in parlors across New England. Through a crack in the wooden wall, Catherine pressed her eye to watch the men assembled outside. Some had mean faces, their eyes calculating the value of unpaid labor. Others looked at her with the hungry expressions of men who believed they deserved whatever they could afford to buy. But there was one man standing apart from the group, and something about his demeanor seemed different from the rest. This man was tall, with sandy brown hair that needed cutting and tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He wore clean but patched clothing, and his hands showed the rough calluses of someone who worked with timber and tools. While the other men laughed and made crude jokes about purchasing damaged goods, he stood quietly, watching everything with a frown that suggested disapproval rather than interest. "What's the woman's name?" the tall man asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested he'd come from somewhere beyond Massachusetts. Aunt Gertrude seemed surprised anyone cared to ask. Catherine Morris, though I suppose she'll answer to whatever name you give her. Names don't matter much when you're buying help." "Names always matter," the man said firmly, and Catherine felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. No one had spoken her name with respect in longer than she could remember. Her own relatives had taken to calling her the burden when they thought she wasn't listening, or simply you when addressing her directly. "Can she speak for herself?" the tall man continued, stepping closer to the platform where Catherine waited behind the wooden partition. Now, Aunt Gertrude looked irritated, as if the questions were delaying a simple business transaction. "Of course she can speak. Too much, if you ask me. Always reading books, always asking questions about things that don't concern women. That's probably why she never found a husband. Men don't want wives who think they're smarter than their betters." The tall man moved closer to the building. "Miss Catherine, would you come out here, please?" "Please," The word hung in the cold air like a gift Catherine hadn't expected to receive. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had said please to her, as if her compliance was something to be requested rather than demanded. She took a deep breath and pushed through the door that led to the platform. The February sunlight struck her face after the darkness of the auction house, making her blink rapidly. When her vision cleared, she saw all the men staring at her with various expressions. Some looked disappointed, as if she weren't young or pretty enough to justify the expense. Others nodded approvingly, calculating her potential usefulness. But the tall man just looked sad, as if witnessing this scene caused him genuine pain. "Miss Catherine," he said gently, removing his worn hat in a gesture of respect that shocked everyone present. "My name is Marcus Wellington. I have 8 children, and a timber farm about 15 miles north of here. I need help managing my household. Would you be willing to come work for my family?" Work for his family, not be owned by them, not be treated as property purchased at auction. Catherine looked at her aunt, whose face had turned red with anger at this unconventional approach to what should have been a straightforward transaction. She looked at the other men, who were whispering among themselves about the strange way Marcus was treating her, as if she were a person capable of making choices rather than merchandise to be claimed. Then she looked back at Marcus Wellington and saw something in his eyes that she hadn't encountered in a very long time. Kindness mixed with respect, and beneath that, a weariness that suggested he understood what it felt like to be judged harshly by circumstances beyond his control. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I would be willing." Marcus nodded and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out more money than Catherine had ever seen in one place and handed it to Aunt Gertrude. But instead of walking away immediately, he turned back to Catherine with continued attention to her comfort and dignity. "Do you have everything you need from inside?" he asked, gesturing toward the auction house. Catherine held up her small bundle. "This contains everything I own." Marcus's frown deepened as he studied the meager possessions. "That's all your belongings?" Aunt Gertrude spoke up quickly, eager to complete the transaction before any complications arose. "She doesn't need much. Never was one for material things. Always had her nose in books instead of learning proper domestic skills." But Marcus was looking at Catherine, not her aunt. His attention remained focused on her as a person, rather than on the woman trying to sell her. "Is there anything else you'd like to take? Anything that belongs to you personally?" Catherine thought about her mother's old sewing box, sitting in the attic of her aunt's house, where it had been moved after her parents died. She thought about the small collection of books she'd managed to keep hidden under loose floorboards, now certainly discovered and probably burned. She thought about the letters her father had written to her mother during their courtship, letters that had taught Catherine what real love looked like and made her unwilling to settle for less. "No, sir," she said, her voice stronger now. "Nothing else belongs to me." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and Catherine had the unsettling feeling that he could see through her polite lie to the grief beneath. Then he did something that shocked everyone present, including Catherine herself. He took off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, despite the fact that it left him vulnerable to the bitter February wind. "Well then," he said, his voice warm despite the cold. "Let's go home." As they walked toward his horse and wagon, Catherine heard her aunt calling after them. "She's your problem now, Wellington. Don't come crying to me when she disappoints you with her strange ideas and stubborn ways." Catherine didn't look back. For the first time in the 3 years since her parents had died, she was walking towards something instead of being dragged away from it. The coat smelled like pine sawdust and wood smoke, scents that spoke of honest work and comfortable homes. "Mr. Wellington," she said, as he helped her into the wagon with careful attention to her comfort. "Yes, Miss Catherine. Thank you for asking my name." and for using it. Marcus smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone had given her since, before her parents' deaths. "Everyone deserves to be called by their name," he said simply. "It's the first way we show people they matter." As the wagon rolled away from the auction house, Catherine looked up at the grey February sky above Massachusetts and wondered if perhaps her life was finally beginning, instead of ending. The weight of Marcus's coat around her shoulders felt like the first kindness she'd received in years. Marcus Wellington had travelled to Millbrook that morning looking for lumber supplies, not a woman to help with his household. But standing in that courtyard, listening to Gertrude Morris sell her niece like a piece of unwanted furniture, had made his chest burn with an anger that surprised him with its intensity. The 35-year-old widower knew what it felt like to be judged harshly by circumstances beyond his control. 18 months ago, his wife Elizabeth had died in a logging accident while helping him clear trees for their expanded farmhouse. The massive oak they'd been working on had fallen in an unexpected direction, and Elizabeth had pushed him to safety. At the cost of her own life, the guilt and grief had nearly destroyed him, leaving him alone with 8 children who needed him to be strong when he felt anything but strong. "She's past her prime," Gertrude Morris was announcing to the crowd. "Of men, but she's still got plenty of work left in her. Knows how to cook, clean, mend clothes. Not much use for anything else at her age." Marcus watched the building where Catherine waited and felt sick to his stomach. These men were discussing a human being as if she were livestock, evaluating her worth based solely on her potential usefulness to them. He'd seen this kind of desperation before, during the economic troubles that had hit New England in recent years. Families sold whatever they had just to survive another winter, but that didn't make it right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How much are you asking?" called out Benjamin Pierce, who owned the textile mill in town. Pierce was known for working his employees to exhaustion and paying them barely enough to survive. Marcus had heard stories about how Pierce treated the women who worked in his factories, stories that made him want to keep his own daughters far away from such men. $40 and she's yours," Gertrude replied. "Fair price for a woman who can work but won't give you the complications of a younger wife." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about Elizabeth, who had been worth more than all the money in Massachusetts, not because she was young or beautiful, but because she was intelligent and kind, and had made their house feel like a home filled with love and laughter. "I'll pay 50, Marcus heard himself say, every head turning toward him in surprise. Pierce laughed, a sound like metal scraping against stone. "Wellington, you already got more children than you can handle. What do you want with a woman too? Told to give you more." Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "That's my business, not yours." Another man stepped forward from the crowd. "I'll pay 60. I need someone to cook for my ranch hands and keep my house in order." Marcus knew this man, Robert Thompson, and he knew the stories about how Thompson treated the women who worked for him. No woman deserved that kind of life, especially not one who had already been hurt by people who should have protected her. $70, Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made his decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. The crowd went quiet. $70 was more money than most men earned in 4 months of steady work. Gertrude Morris's eyes widened with greed as she realized this auction might bring in far more than she'd expected. "Now you're talking sense," Gertrude said, her voice eager. $70 it is." But Marcus held up his hand before she could declare the sale complete. "Not so fast. I want to speak with the lady first." "Speak with her?" Thompson laughed. "What for? She'll do what she's told once you pay for her." "Not in my house, she won't," Marcus said, his voice carrying a steel edge that made several men step back. "In my house, people get to choose what they do with their lives. This caused murmurs of confusion among the men. The idea of a woman having choices was strange to most of them, particularly a woman who had been purchased at auction. But Marcus remembered Elizabeth, how she'd always spoken her mind and challenged him to think more deeply about right and wrong. Their marriage had been a partnership of equals, and he wouldn't accept anything less for the woman who might help care for his children. When Catherine emerged from the auction house, Marcus felt his heart break a little. She was thin and pale, as if she hadn't been eating enough or getting enough sunlight. Her dress was old and carefully mended, but clean and neat. Her eyes moved nervously around the crowd like a deer surrounded by wolves, looking for escape, routes that didn't exist. But when he spoke to her gently, when he asked her permission instead of giving her orders, something changed in her posture. She stood straighter, her voice grew stronger, and when she agreed to come with him, Marcus heard something in her tone that surprised him. Hope mixed with determination, as if she was choosing to trust him despite having every reason to distrust all men. The ride back to his farm started in silence. Catherine sat as far from him as possible on the wagon seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared at the road ahead. Marcus understood her wariness. He was still a stranger to her, and she had no reason to trust any man after what she'd been through. "Tell me about your children," Catherine said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Marcus was surprised that she'd spoken first, but pleased by her interest in his family. "Well, there's Thomas. He's 19, thinks he's the man of the house since his mother died. Good boy, but he carries too much responsibility for someone his age." Catherine nodded as if she understood about carrying burdens that belong to adults. "Then there's Margaret. She's 16, been trying to take care of everyone since Elizabeth passed. Smart as anyone I've ever met, but she's forgotten how to be young." The twins, James and Jonathan, are 14. They're like two halves of the same person. Where one goes, the other follows. Both of them are good with their hands, love working with wood and tools. Catherine listened carefully, as if memorizing details about people who might become important to her. Then there's Anne. She's 12 now, loves to read when she can find books, always asking questions about everything she sees. Samuel is 10, loves animals more than people sometimes, has a way with horses and cattle that seems almost magical. And little Lucy is 8, barely remembers her mother but feels the missing. Anyway, Marcus's voice grew soft as he spoke about his youngest. And baby Rose is just 5. She needs someone who understands how to be gentle with little hearts that have been broken by loss. "They sound like wonderful children," Catherine said quietly. "They are," Marcus replied, "but they need more than I can give them alone. They need someone who sees them as individuals, not just work to be done or mouths to be fed. Elizabeth used to say that children need to know they matter for who they are, not just for what they can do." Catherine was quiet for a long time, and Marcus began to worry that he'd said something wrong. Finally, she asked, "What if I disappoint them? What if I'm not good enough to replace what they've lost?" Marcus looked at this woman who'd been thrown away by everyone who should have valued her, and felt his admiration for her grow. Even in her own pain, she was thinking about his children's welfare. "Miss Catherine," he said gently, "disappointment comes from expecting people to be something they're not. I'm not expecting you to be Elizabeth. I'm not expecting you to be perfect. I'm just hoping you'll care about my children and maybe let them care about you in return." When they reached the farm, 8 faces pressed against the kitchen window like flowers turning toward sunlight. Marcus could see his children's curiosity and worry in their expressions. They'd been through so much loss already. Would they be able to open their hearts to this quiet woman with tired eyes? "Are you ready?" Marcus asked as they sat in the wagon, both of them looking at the house that might become Catherine's new home. Catherine took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders with visible determination. "Yes," she said, and Marcus heard a strength in her voice that hadn't been there at the auction house. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the house together, Marcus found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could all heal each other. After all, the best families weren't always born from blood relations. Sometimes they were chosen by people brave enough to believe in second chances and strong enough to build love from the broken pieces of their lives. 8-year-old Lucy Wellington was perched dangerously high in the old maple tree beside the barn, her small voice echoing across the farmyard as she called for help. Catherine dropped the firewood she'd been stacking and rushed toward the tree without hesitation, her skirts flying behind her as she assessed the situation. Below the towering maple, 7 children stood looking up at their sister, who clung to a thick branch 15 feet above ground. Lucy had climbed up chasing their escaped kitten, Patches, but now both girl and cat were stranded among the swaying branches. "Papa's in the north pasture, checking the timber boundaries," Thomas explained, his 19-year-old voice tight with worry. "He won't hear us calling from way out there." Margaret wrung her hands anxiously. "Lucy's been up there for 20 minutes. She's getting scared and tired." Catherine studied the tree, remembering her own childhood adventures, climbing the ancient oaks behind her family's farm in Connecticut. The bark was rough but sturdy, with plenty of handholds and footholds for someone who knew what to look for. Before anyone could stop her, she gathered her skirts and tucked them securely into her belt, then kicked off her worn boots and began climbing. "Miss Catherine, what are you doing?" Margaret gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Getting your sister." "Down," Catherine called over her shoulder, already 10 feet off the ground. The children watched in amazement as this woman they barely knew scaled the maple tree with the confidence of someone who'd spent her childhood among branches and leaves. Catherine's muscles remembered the rhythm of climbing, the way to test each her branch before trusting it with her weight, the importance of keeping 3 points of contact while moving the 4th. Soon she was sitting on the branch next to Lucy, who was clutching Patches the kitten against her chest. "I can't get down," Lucy whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "Everything looks so high and scary from up here." "I understand that feeling," Catherine said gently, settling herself securely on the branch. "But we're going to go down together, one step at a time. I'll show you where to put your hands and feet." What happened next surprised everyone, including Catherine herself. Lucy shifted closer and leaned against her, the kitten purring softly between them. For the first time in years, Catherine felt the complete trust of a child, the weight of someone, small and vulnerable, believing, absolutely, in her ability to keep them safe. They descended slowly, Catherine guiding Lucy's feet to each secure spot while keeping one protective arm around the little girl. When they finally reached the ground, all 7 children were staring at Catherine with expressions of newfound respect and wonder. "How did you learn to climb like that?" James asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "My father taught me when I was about Lucy's age," Catherine answered, brushing bark dust from her skirt. "He believed every girl should know how to rescue herself, and sometimes others too." Thomas stepped forward, and Catherine noticed he had his father's serious expression and thoughtful manner. "Thank you for helping Lucy. Most ladies would have just sent someone for help and waited." "I'm not like most ladies," Catherine replied, then immediately wondered if admitting such a thing was wise. Margaret smiled for the first time since Catherine had arrived. "That's probably a good thing. Most ladies wouldn't last a week on a timber farm like this one." As they walked back toward the house, Catherine learned more about the Wellington children in 30 minutes than she'd expected to discover in weeks. Margaret had been managing the household since she was 14, cooking for 9 people and keeping track of everyone's needs and schedules. Thomas worked alongside his father every day, learning the timber business, but he dreamed of studying engineering and building bridges that would connect isolated communities. The twins, James and Jonathan, were opposites in personality despite their identical appearance. James loved working with his hands, carving intricate figures from scraps of wood, while Jonathan preferred reading and keeping detailed records of the farm's operations. Anne, at 12, was curious about everything and asked questions that sometimes challenged adult assumptions about how the world worked. Samuel, the 10-year-old, had an almost magical connection with animals. He could calm spooked horses with a whisper and had trained their dog, Rex, to help herd cattle. Little Lucy was the family's source of joy and mischief, always finding adventures in ordinary moments. And then there was 5-year-old Rose, who had attached herself to Catherine's skirt and hadn't let go since the tree rescue. Rose spoke in whispers and watched everything with enormous blue eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any child should carry. Inside the farmhouse, Catherine got her first real look at what would become her new home. The kitchen was spacious, but chaotic, with dishes stacked on every available surface and laundry hanging from pegs driven into the wooden walls. The main room contained comfortable but mismatched furniture, and everything bore the signs of a household where necessity took precedence over beauty. "Papa does his best," Margaret said, noticing Catherine's careful assessment of the surroundings. "But there's always so much work to do, and only so many hours in each day." Catherine rolled up her sleeves, feeling a familiar energy stirring within her. "Well, let's see what we can accomplish before he returns from the pasture." What followed was unlike anything the Wellington children had ever experienced. Catherine didn't just clean. She organized systems that would make future cleaning easier. She didn't just cook. She taught the older children techniques that would help them contribute more effectively. She didn't just mend their clothes. She showed them tricks for making repairs nearly invisible and longer lasting. But the real transformation happened in the way she interacted with each child individually. She listened to Thomas's ideas about bridge engineering and asked thoughtful questions that helped him develop his concepts further. She encouraged Margaret to sing while they worked, drawing out a beautiful voice that had been silenced by too much responsibility too young. She challenged the twins to use their different strengths collaboratively, showing James how his woodcarving skills could complement Jonathan's mathematical precision. She answered Anne's endless questions seriously, treating a 12-year-old's curiosity with the respect usually reserved for adult scholars. With Samuel, she shared stories about the farm animals she'd known as a child, and she listened carefully to his observations about their current livestock. She joined Lucy's games while still accomplishing household tasks, proving that work and play could coexist beautifully. And with little Rose, Catherine was infinitely patient, speaking softly and moving slowly, understanding instinctively that this child needed gentle reassurance more than anything else. The real magic occurred when evening arrived, and Marcus returned from his work in the timber lots. He found his house transformed not just in cleanliness and organization, but in atmosphere. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, candles flickered warmly on the scrubbed table, and his children were gathered around Catherine as she helped Rose practice writing her letters. "Papa!" Lucy called out, running to greet him with more enthusiasm than she'd shown in months. Miss Catherine climbed the tree to save me and Patches, and then we made supper together, and she knows songs about birds, and she can fix anything that's broken. Marcus looked at Catherine, who had gone suddenly shy under his gaze. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the tree-climbing adventure, and there was flour dusting her dark blue dress from the bread-making session. But her cheeks were flushed with satisfaction, and her eyes held a light that hadn't been there at the auction house. "Sounds like you've had quite an eventful day," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "It's been wonderful," Catherine replied, and meant it completely. For the first time in 3 years, she'd felt useful, not because someone demanded her labor, but because she was choosing to contribute to something meaningful. That night, as the family sat down to their first meal together, Catherine experienced something she'd never known before. Lucy insisted on sitting beside her, leaning against her arm, as if Catherine were a beloved aunt returning after a long absence. Margaret asked eagerly if she could learn the bread recipe that had produced such perfect results. Even Thomas seemed more relaxed, as if having another adult in the house had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. But it was the conversation that surprised Catherine most profoundly. In her previous life, meals had been silent affairs where children spoke only when addressed directly by adults. Here everyone shared stories about their day. Marcus asked each child about their activities and listened to their responses as if their words carried genuine importance. The children asked Catherine questions about her life before coming to the farm, and they listened to her answers with respectful attention. "Miss Catherine," Anne said during a pause in the chatter, "are you planning to stay with us for a long time?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Catherine looked around the table at 8 faces waiting for her answer, some hopeful, some cautious, all genuinely interested in her response. "I hope so," she said finally, "if your father and all of you will have me." "We want you to stay," Rose whispered, speaking more words at once than she'd managed since Catherine's arrival. Later that evening, after the children were settled in their beds, Catherine sat on the front porch watching stars appear over the Massachusetts hills. The February night was cold, but she felt warmer than she had in years. Marcus joined her, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee that filled the air with rich, comforting aromas. "They've taken to you remarkably quickly," he observed, settling into the chair beside hers. "They're exceptional children," Catherine replied sincerely. "You've raised them to be kind and thoughtful. That's not easy when you're managing so much responsibility alone." Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring out at the dark shapes of the hills against the star-filled sky. "It hasn't been easy since Elizabeth died. Margaret had too much responsibility. For someone her age, Thomas has had to grow up too fast. The little ones miss having a mother's attention." "They need what every child needs," Catherine said softly. "Love, attention, and someone who believes they're valuable for who they are, not just for what they can contribute to the household." As they sat in comfortable silence, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents died. Peace. The hills were dark silhouettes against the winter sky, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. For the first time since her aunt had announced her intention to sell her, Catherine began to believe that perhaps she might have found where she belonged. But what she didn't yet understand was that her presence had already been noticed by others in the community, and not everyone approved of the Wellington family's new arrangement. Change was coming, and it would test everything they were beginning to build together. The next morning brought new challenges that would prove whether yesterday's harmony could survive real-world pressures. Catherine woke before dawn, as was her habit, and made her way quietly to the kitchen to start the day's bread. She found Rose already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her doll, humming softly to herself. "Good morning, little one," Catherine whispered, not wanting to wake the rest of the house. Rose looked up with those enormous blue eyes and smiled. "Good morning, Miss Catherine. Are you making bread again?" "Would you like to help?" Catherine asked, and Rose nodded eagerly. As they worked together, mixing flour and water and yeast into something that would nourish the entire family, Catherine felt a deep satisfaction settling into her bones. This was what she'd been meant to do. Not because she was a woman and therefore obligated to cook and clean, but because she chose to use her skills to care for people who mattered to her. The other children woke gradually, drawn by the smell of baking bread and the sound of quiet conversation in the kitchen. By the time Marcus appeared, dressed for another day of timber work, the house was filled with the comfortable bustle of a family beginning their day together. "Miss Catherine," Thomas said as they finished breakfast, "would you like to see the timber operations? Papa could show you around the property." Catherine looked at Marcus questioningly. She was curious about the work that supported this family, but she didn't want to impose on his busy schedule. "I'd be happy to show you around," Marcus said. "It would be good for you to understand how we make our living here." The tour of the Wellington timber farm revealed the scope of Marcus's enterprise and explained why he worked such long hours. The family owned 200 acres of prime forest land, with stands of oak, maple, and pine that provided lumber for construction projects throughout western Massachusetts. Marcus had built a small sawmill powered by the creek that ran through their property, and he employed 6 men from the surrounding area to help with the cutting and milling operations. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring constant attention to safety and quality. "Elizabeth used to help with the bookkeeping," Marcus explained as they stood beside the creek, watching the water wheel turn. "She had a head for numbers and could spot problems before they became serious. Since she died, I've been trying to manage both the physical work and the business side, but it's more than one person can handle effectively." Catherine listened carefully, understanding that he was sharing not just information, but also trust. "I'm good with numbers," she said, quietly. "I kept the accounts for my father's farm before he died, and I helped manage the household budget for my aunt. If you'd like, I could look at your books and see if there's anything I can do to help." The relief that crossed Marcus's face told Catherine everything she needed to know about how much he'd been struggling to keep up with all his responsibilities. That would be wonderful," he said. "I'd be grateful for any help you could provide." As they walked back toward the house, Catherine felt another piece of her new life falling into place. She wasn't just someone who cooked and cleaned for the Wellington family. She was becoming a partner in their enterprise, someone whose skills and intelligence were valued and needed, but she also sensed that this new sense of belonging would be tested soon. In a small community like theirs, change was always noticed, and not everyone would approve of an unmarried woman living and working so closely with a widowed man and his children. The afternoon brought their first real challenge, in the form of Mrs. Abigail Thornton riding up to the Wellington farmhouse on her grey mare. Mrs. Thornton was the wife of the town's most prominent banker, and she had appointed herself the guardian of moral standards for the entire community. Catherine was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sharp voice carrying across the yard. Through the flapping sheets, she could see Mrs. Thornton's stern expression and Marcus's surprised reaction as he emerged from the barn to greet his unexpected visitor. The conversation that followed would determine whether Catherine's new life could survive the scrutiny of people who believed they had the right to judge how others chose to live. Everything she'd begun to hope for hung in the balance of what happened next. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's sharp voice cut through the March morning air like a judge delivering a verdict. "Marcus Wellington, I need to speak with you about this highly irregular situation you've created with that unmarried woman living in your household." Catherine pressed herself against the side of the house, her heart pounding as she listened to words that could destroy the fragile happiness she'd begun to build. Through the window, she could see the children gathered around the kitchen table, their morning lessons forgotten as they strained to hear the conversation that would determine their family's future. "Good morning, Abigail," Marcus replied, his voice carefully polite but carrying an underlying tension. "What brings you out to our farm so early?" "Don't play innocent with me," Mrs. Thornton snapped, dismounting from her horse with the righteous anger of someone convinced of her own moral authority. "The entire town is talking about the scandalous arrangement you have here. An unmarried woman of questionable background living under the same roof as a widowed man and 8 impressionable children." Catherine felt her stomach clench with familiar shame. She'd known this moment would come, but hearing the accusations spoken aloud brought back all the feelings of worthlessness that had plagued her at her aunt's house. Inside the kitchen, she could see Margaret's face appear at the window, the 16-year-old's expression fierce with protective loyalty. "Miss Catherine is here to help manage our household," Marcus replied calmly, though Catherine could detect steel beneath his measured tone. "Nothing more, nothing less." "Nothing more?" Mrs. Thornton's voice rose indignantly. "A woman of her age, living in such close proximity to a man, sharing meals, sharing daily life. It's improper, Marcus, and you know it perfectly well." Thomas emerged from the house, his 19-year-old frame filling the doorway as he stepped onto the porch. Behind him, Catherine could see the other children clustering together, their faces showing confusion and fear at the hostility directed towards someone they'd come to care about. "Mrs. Thornton?" Thomas said with the careful respect due to an elder, but his voice carried his father's firmness. "Miss Catherine has done nothing but help our family. She's teaching the little ones their letters, helping Margaret with the heavy housework, and making our home feel like a real home again." "Young man, you have no understanding of adult matters," Mrs. Thornton replied sharply. "There are proper ways for decent people to live, and this arrangement violates every standard of Christian morality." Margaret appeared beside her brother, her face flushed with anger. "What's Christian about 8 children trying to raise themselves? What's moral about condemning someone who's shown us nothing but kindness? Children should be seen and not heard when adults are discussing serious matters," Mrs. Thornton declared, but her authority was beginning to crack under the united front of the Wellington family. Catherine watched this confrontation with growing amazement. These children, her children, she realized with sudden clarity, were standing up to defend her against one of the most powerful women in their community. But she also understood the real danger Mrs. Thornton represented. In small towns, social approval could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. Anne appeared in the doorway, her 12-year-old voice cutting through the adult arguments with startling clarity. "Mrs. Thornton, didn't Jesus eat with people that the religious leaders said were wrong? Didn't he say we should help each other instead of judging each other?" The silence that followed Anne's question was so complete that Catherine could hear the creek running behind the house and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees on the hillside. Mrs. Thornton's face cycled through several expressions before settling on frustrated anger. "That's entirely different, child. You're too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships and community standards." "I understand that Miss Catherine fixed my broken doll," little Lucy said, appearing suddenly beside Anne. "And she helped me down from the tree when I was scared, and she makes the best pancakes in the whole world." Samuel joined his sisters, his 10-year-old face serious with the gravity of adult concerns. "She helped birth our new calf when Papa was away, and she knew exactly what to do when Thunder got colic. Mama used to do things like that." The mention of Elizabeth seemed to deflate Mrs. Thornton's righteous anger slightly. She had known and respected Marcus's late wife, and the children's obvious love for Catherine created a complication in her moral calculations. "The point remains," Mrs. Thornton said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction that decent people don't live this way. "Either this woman finds proper employment elsewhere, or the community will be forced to take action to protect its standards." Catherine had heard enough. She stepped around the corner of the house, her chin raised and her shoulders straight, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate your concern for the community's welfare. But I wonder if you've considered the welfare of these 8 children who lost their mother and need someone to care about their daily needs." Mrs. Thornton's eyes narrowed as she studied Catherine, taking in her neat appearance and dignified bearing. "And what qualifications do you have to care for children, Miss Morris? What references can you provide? What assurance do we have that you're a fit influence on young minds?" "The same qualifications any mother has," Catherine replied steadily. "Love, patience, and the willingness to put their needs before my own comfort. As for references, ask Thomas about his engineering studies. Ask Margaret about the music lessons I've been giving her. Ask any of these children if they feel safer and happier than they did 3 weeks ago." Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself beside Catherine in a gesture of support that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate your concern, but how I manage my household is my responsibility. These children are thriving under Catherine's care, and that's what matters to me. It becomes the community's business when it affects our collective moral standing," Mrs. Thornton replied, but her tone suggested she was fighting a losing battle. "What example does this set for other families? What message does it send to our young people about proper behavior?" "It sends the message that we help each other when help is needed," Rose whispered, speaking from behind Margaret's skirt. The 5-year-old's small voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Miss Catherine helps us every day. Isn't that what church people are supposed to do?" Mrs. Thornton looked down at Rose, and for a moment her stern expression softened. But she recovered quickly, straightening her shoulders and preparing to deliver her final ultimatum. "I'll be speaking to Reverend Phillips about this situation," she announced, "and to the other prominent families in our community. People have a right to know what kind of example is being set for their children." After she rode away, the Wellington family stood in the yard like survivors of a storm, uncertain whether the danger had passed or was just beginning. Catherine felt the weight of 8 pairs of eyes looking at her, waiting to see if she would abandon them rather than face continued scrutiny. "Don't listen to her," Margaret said fiercely. "She's just a bitter woman who doesn't have enough joy in her own life." But Catherine knew it wasn't that simple. Mrs. Thornton spoke for the respectable people of their community, and their disapproval could have serious consequences. Marcus could lose customers for his timber business. The children could be shunned at school, and the entire family could find themselves isolated from the social connections they needed for survival. That evening, as Catherine helped the younger children prepare for bed, she wrestled with a decision that could break her heart but might protect the family she'd come to love. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if she left before the community's pressure destroyed what Marcus had worked so hard to build. But as she tucked Rose into bed, the little girl's small hand gripped hers tightly. "You're not going away, are you, Miss Catherine? Mrs. Thornton was mean, but you're not going to let mean people make you leave us, are you?" Catherine looked down at Rose's trusting face and felt her resolve crystallize. She had spent 3 years letting other people's judgments determine her worth and her choices. She wouldn't make that mistake again. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my family now, and families stick together when times get difficult." The next few weeks tested that commitment in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. At the general store, conversations stopped when she entered, and other customers moved away from her as if moral failure might be contagious. At church, the family found themselves sitting alone in pews that had previously been shared with neighbors and friends. But something unexpected began to happen. For every person who turned away from them, another stepped forward with quiet support. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the town's physician, made a point of greeting Catherine warmly when their paths crossed. Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, who ran the lending library, saved new books for Anne and even began ordering titles she thought Catherine might enjoy. Most surprisingly, other women began seeking Catherine's advice on household matters and child-rearing challenges. Word had spread about her skill in managing 8 children and a complex household, and mothers struggling with their own families started appearing at the Wellington farm with questions and requests for help. "Mrs. Fletcher wants to know if you can teach her daughter to bake bread," Margaret reported one afternoon, returning from town with a basket of goods and a list of messages. "And Mrs. Coleman asked if you'd look at her baby's rash. She said Dr. Hayes recommended you." Catherine felt a warm glow of pride at this evidence that her skills were valued beyond the Wellington household. But more importantly, she realized that she was building her own network of support within the community, independent of Mrs. Thornton's social circle. The real test came when the spring planting season arrived, and Marcus needed to spend long days in the fields, leaving Catherine alone with the children. This was when any household management problems would become obvious, when the community would see whether she could truly handle the responsibilities she'd undertaken. Instead of cracking under the pressure, Catherine thrived. She organized the children into efficient teams for household chores, turning work into games that made even the most tedious tasks enjoyable. She established schedules that balanced education, work, and play, ensuring that each child received individual attention despite the large family size. When baby Jonathan came down with a fever that lasted for days, Catherine nursed him through the crisis with the skill of someone who understood both medicine and mothering. When the spring rains flooded the creek and threatened their small bridge, she organized the older children to reinforce it with stones and timber, saving Marcus hours of repair work. But perhaps most importantly, she began to see changes in the children that went beyond mere household efficiency. Thomas started talking about his engineering dreams with renewed enthusiasm, inspired by Catherine's belief that education could open doors to any future he chose to pursue. Margaret began singing again, her voice filling the house with melodies that had been silent since her mother's death. The twins developed confidence in their individual strengths, no longer feeling they had to be identical in all things. Anne's curiosity flourished under Catherine's patient answers to endless questions. Samuel's gift with animals expanded to include training techniques that impressed even experienced farmers. Lucy's natural exuberance found healthy outlets in organized activities and creative projects, and Rose, who had been so withdrawn and fearful, began to blossom into a chattering, laughing little girl who trusted the world enough to explore it safely. These changes didn't go unnoticed in the community. When the children appeared in town, their obvious health and happiness provided the strongest argument for Catherine's positive influence. Clean, well-behaved, and clearly thriving, they were living proof that unconventional arrangements could produce conventional virtues. Dr. Hayes made a point of mentioning to other prominent citizens that the Wellington children were among the healthiest and best adjusted in the entire area. The schoolteacher, Miss Patricia Lawson, praised their academic progress and social development. Even Reverend Phillips, despite pressure from Mrs. Thornton, had to acknowledge that the fruits of Catherine's influence were entirely positive. The turning point came during the community's spring festival, when families gathered to celebrate the end of winter and the promise of new growth. Catherine had initially planned to stay home, avoiding the social scrutiny that such events inevitably brought. But the children had other ideas. "You have to come, Miss Catherine," Anne insisted. "Everyone will be there, and we want to show people that we're proud of our family." Margaret nodded agreement. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson specifically asked if you'd be willing to help judge the baking contest. She said your reputation for excellent bread has spread throughout the county," Thomas added his voice to the chorus, "and Mr. Henderson wants to discuss your ideas about improving the school's mathematics curriculum. He says Anne's progress has been remarkable since you started helping her with advanced problems." Faced with such united determination from her children, Catherine agreed to attend the festival. What she discovered there would change her understanding of her place in the community and her prospects for building a permanent life with the Wellington family. The festival proved to be a revelation. Instead of the cold shoulders and whispered criticism she'd expected, Catherine found herself surrounded by people eager to speak with her. Parents sought her advice about educational techniques, mothers asked for her recipes and household management tips, and community leaders included her in discussions about improvements to local schools and services. Mrs. Patterson, the mill owner's wife and unofficial social leader, made a point of introducing Catherine to visitors from neighboring towns. "This is Miss Catherine Morris," she said proudly. "She's transformed the Wellington household and become one of our community's most valuable resources." Even more surprising was the response of the children from other families. They flocked to the Wellington children, drawn by their obvious confidence and contentment. Games that started with 1 or 2 participants quickly grew to include a dozen youngsters, all following the leadership of Thomas, Margaret, and the twins. As Catherine watched her children interact with their peers, she realized that her influence extended far beyond their immediate family. They were teaching other children about cooperation, kindness, and the kind of inclusive behavior that makes communities stronger. Her impact was rippling outward in ways she'd never imagined possible. The day's events culminated when little Rose, normally so shy around strangers, stood up during the community singing and requested that Miss Catherine share the lullaby she sang to help everyone fall asleep on stormy nights. The entire gathering fell silent as Catherine's clear, sweet voice filled the evening air with a melody that spoke of comfort, safety, and home. When the song ended, the applause was genuine and warm. But more than that, Catherine saw acceptance in the faces around her. Not the grudging tolerance she'd feared, but genuine appreciation for what she brought to their community. Later that evening, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, Marcus took her hand for the first time since they'd met. "Thank you," he said simply, "for choosing us, for staying when it would have been easier to leave, for showing my children what it means to fight for the people you love." Catherine squeezed his fingers, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had held his family together through their darkest times. "Thank you for seeing something worth fighting for," she replied. As they reached their farmhouse, windows glowing warmly in the darkness, Catherine realized that she'd found something she'd never dared to hope for. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just a place to live, but a home to love. Not just survival, but the chance to flourish in ways she'd never imagined possible. The woman who had been sold at auction because she was deemed too old for marriage had discovered that her real value had nothing to do with age or conventional expectations. Her worth lay in her capacity to love, to nurture, to build bridges between people, and to create the kind of family that strengthened entire communities. But even as Catherine settled into bed that night, filled with gratitude for how far she'd come, she didn't know that greater challenges were approaching. The life she was building would soon face tests that would require every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. The letter arrived on a sweltering July morning, delivered by a grim-faced courier who refused to meet Catherine's eyes. As he handed over the official-looking envelope, the Massachusetts state seal, pressed into red wax, told her everything she needed to know before she even broke it open. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the heavy paper and read words that could destroy everything she'd built with the Wellington family. Notice of moral inquiry was printed across the top in bold black letters. Below, in the formal language of legal documents, the state informed Catherine that allegations had been made regarding her unsuitable cohabitation with Marcus Wellington and his minor children. A hearing was scheduled for August 15th to determine whether the children should be removed from what anonymous complainants termed an environment of moral corruption. Catherine's knees went weak as she realized the full implications. Someone had convinced state authorities that the Wellington children were in danger because of her presence in their home. If the hearing went against them, the family would be torn apart, the children scattered to orphanages or distant relatives, and everything they'd worked to build together would be destroyed. The kitchen door burst open as Thomas came running. In from the fields, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Miss Catherine, there's a man with a badge asking questions about our family at Henderson Place. Papa sent me to warn you that trouble might be coming." Catherine quickly folded the letter and slipped it into her apron pocket. Thomas was 19, old enough to understand the gravity of their situation, but the younger children didn't need to be frightened until she and Marcus could figure out how to respond to this threat. "Where is your father now?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "Meeting with Sheriff Morrison at the mill. The sheriff got some kind of official complaint about our family, and he has to investigate whether there's any truth to it." Thomas's young face showed the strain of carrying adult worries. "Miss Catherine, what's really happening? Why would anyone want to hurt our family?" Before Catherine could answer, the sound of horses approaching at speed drew their attention to the windows. Through the glass, she saw Marcus riding hard toward the house, followed by two men in dark suits who looked like government officials. Behind them came Dr. Hayes, his medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank as he struggled to keep pace. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this wasn't just an investigation, it was a formal inspection that could end with the children being taken away immediately if the officials found the household unsuitable. "Thomas, quickly," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. "Gather all the children and tell them we're having unexpected guests who need to see how well organized our home is. Make sure everyone is clean and properly dressed. This is very important." Marcus burst through the door moments later, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "Catherine, they've come to inspect our home and interview the children. Someone filed a formal complaint with the state, claiming we're providing an immoral environment for minors." "I know," Catherine said, pulling the letter from her pocket. "This came this morning." Marcus scanned the document quickly, his jaw clenching as he read. "Mrs. Thornton," he said through gritted teeth. "She must have written to her cousin in the state capital. He's some kind of official in the Department of Child Welfare." The front door opened to admit two stern-faced men in expensive suits, followed by Dr. Hayes, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. The officials introduced themselves as Inspector Harold Whitman and Inspector Charles Briggs from the Massachusetts Department of Public Welfare. "Mr. Wellington," Inspector Whitman said, his voice carrying the cold authority of bureaucratic power, "we're here to conduct a formal evaluation of your household arrangements. We've received reports that your children are living in an inappropriate situation that may not be in their best interests." Inspector Briggs pulled out a leather portfolio and began making notes as he looked around the kitchen. Catherine noticed his gaze lingering on details that could be interpreted negatively. The children's everyday clothes hanging on pegs, the breakfast dishes still drying beside the sink, the general lived-in appearance of a home where 8 children actually lived and played. "We'll need to interview each child separately," Inspector Whitman continued, "to ensure they can speak freely about their living conditions without fear of reprisal. We'll also need to examine the sleeping arrangements, the educational provisions, and the general moral atmosphere of the household." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by professional firmness. "Gentlemen, as the family's physician, I can provide testimony about the children's health and well-being. I've been treating this family for 3 years, and I can assure you that these children are thriving under Miss Catherine's care." "That's not for you to determine, Doctor," Inspector Briggs replied curtly. "We have standardized procedures for evaluating child welfare situations. Personal opinions, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot override proper official assessment." Margaret appeared in the doorway with the other children ranged behind her like a defensive formation. At 16, she understood exactly what was happening and what was at stake. Her young face showed a maturity that comes from protecting younger siblings through difficult times. "Are you the men who think our family is wrong?" she asked with startling directness. "Because if you are, you should know that Miss Catherine is the best thing that's happened to us since our mother died." Inspector Whitman made a note in his book. "Young lady, you'll have your chance to speak during our individual interviews. Right now, We need the adults to explain the nature of this household arrangement. Catherine stepped forward, drawing on reserves of courage she'd discovered during her months with the Wellington family. Gentlemen, I am Catherine Morris. I work for Mr. Wellington as household manager and governess to his children. I live in this house because the children require supervision at all times, and because my duties begin before dawn and end well after dark. And what exactly are your qualifications for managing a household with 8 children? Inspector Briggs asked, his pen poised to record her response. The same qualifications any mother has, Catherine replied evenly. Love for the children in my care, dedication to their welfare, and the practical skills needed to maintain a healthy educational environment. But you're not their mother, Inspector Whitman pointed out. You're an unmarried woman living in close proximity with a widowed man. Surely you can understand how this arrangement might appear inappropriate to concerned citizens. Thomas stepped forward, his 19-year-old height allowing him to look the inspectors in the eye. Sir, with respect, what appears inappropriate is strangers trying to destroy a family that's working perfectly well. Miss Catherine has taught us more about responsibility, kindness, and moral behavior than we ever learned when we were struggling alone. The twins, James and Jonathan, moved to stand beside Thomas, presenting a united front of Wellington determination. Miss Catherine helped me carve my first really good whistle, James said quietly. She said every boy should know how to make music with his hands. She helped me understand mathematics that even the school teacher couldn't explain, Jonathan added. She says learning is like building a house. You need a strong foundation before you can add the fancy decorations. Inspector Whitman scribbled rapidly, but his expression suggested he wasn't sure what to make of children who spoke so articulately in defense of someone the state was investigating for moral impropriety. Anne appeared at Thomas's elbow, her 12-year-old face serious with the gravity of defending someone she loved. Are you going to take Miss Catherine away from us? She asked directly. Because if you are, you should know that would make us orphans again, and we don't want to be orphans. No one is taking anyone away, Inspector Briggs said, though his tone lacked conviction. We're simply ensuring that you children are living in an appropriate environment. This is an appropriate environment, little Lucy declared, stepping forward with 5-year-old fearlessness. Miss Catherine reads us stories and teaches us songs and makes the best gingerbread cookies in Massachusetts. She fixes everything that gets broken, including people. Samuel, at 10 years old, had been quietly observing the adults with the same careful attention he gave to animals he was trying to understand. Are you here because someone told lies about our family? He asked with devastating simplicity. The question hung in the air like an accusation none of the adults wanted to address directly. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat and stepped forward again. Gentlemen, perhaps I could show you the medical records. For these children, you'll find that their health has improved dramatically since Miss Catherine joined the household. Their nutrition is excellent. Their growth patterns are normal, and their emotional well-being shows every sign of a stable, loving environment. We're not here to evaluate medical care, Inspector Whitman replied. We're here to assess moral fitness and social propriety. And what's more moral than 8 children who've learned to care for each other and contribute to their community? Catherine asked, her voice growing stronger as her initial fear transformed into protective anger. What's more socially proper than a household that produces young people who are honest, educated, and considerate of others? Inspector Briggs looked up from his notes with an expression of bureaucratic impatience. Miss Morris, the issue isn't the children's behavior. The issue is the appearance of impropriety created by your living situation with Mr. Wellington. The appearance of impropriety to whom? Marcus asked, speaking for the first time since the inspectors had arrived. To the neighbors who've seen. our family thriving, to the merchants who've watched our children grow into responsible young people, or to someone who's never set foot on our property but objects to our happiness for reasons that have nothing to do with morality. Margaret stepped forward again, her 16-year-old dignity commanding attention even from hostile adults. Gentlemen, before Miss Catherine came to live with us, I was trying to mother 7 younger children while managing a household that was falling apart. I was 13 years old, cooking for 9 people, doing laundry for 9 people, and trying to keep everyone fed, clean, and safe, while Papa worked 16-hour days just to keep us from losing the farm. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Thomas was working like a grown man, but still trying to finish his education. The little ones were scared all the time because they'd lost their mother and weren't sure they could count on anyone to take care of them. We were surviving, but we weren't living. She gestured toward Catherine with obvious love and respect. Miss Catherine didn't just join our household. She saved our family. She gave me permission to be 16 years old instead of a substitute mother. She helped Thomas pursue his engineering studies. She made the little ones feel safe and loved. Again, if that's immoral, then I don't understand what morality means. Inspector Whitman had stopped taking notes, his expression showing the first crack in his official composure. Young lady, no one is questioning Miss Catherine's contributions to your household management. But there are proper ways for unmarried women to work with families, and living in the same house isn't one of them. What's the proper way? Rose asked, speaking up for the first time since the men had arrived. At 5 years old, she possessed the devastating honesty that adults often find difficult to answer. Should Miss Catherine live somewhere else and come visit us during the day? What would happen when we have nightmares? What would happen when we get sick in the middle of the night? What would happen when the storms come and we need someone to make us feel safe? The question highlighted a practical reality that the inspector's bureaucratic guidelines hadn't anticipated. Children don't limit their need for care to business hours, and a household with 8 youngsters required round-the-clock attention that couldn't be provided by someone who lived elsewhere. Dr. Hayes seized on Rose's question to make a medical point. Gentlemen, as a physician, I can tell you that children's health emergencies don't wait for convenient times. Miss Catherine has handled several medical crises with skill that probably saved lives. When the twins came down with scarlet fever last winter, her nursing care was the difference between recovery and potential tragedy. She knows how to birth calves and treat colic in horses too, Samuel added helpfully. Papa says she's got healing hands for animals and people both. Inspector Briggs looked increasingly uncomfortable as the interviews continued to highlight Catherine's competence rather than revealing the moral failings they'd been sent to investigate. Mr. Wellington, surely you can see that alternative. Arrangements could be made. A married couple could be hired to manage your household, or the children could be placed with relatives who could provide more conventional family structures. The suggestion hit the Wellington family like a physical blow. Catherine watched the children's faces drain of color as they realized that the state had the power to tear their family apart, scattering them to distant relatives or institutional care regardless of their own wishes. Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge as he responded. Inspector Briggs, these children lost their mother in a tragic accident. They've finally found stability and happiness again. You're suggesting that we destroy what's working well to satisfy someone's abstract notion of propriety? We're suggesting that proper moral standards be maintained, Inspector Whitman replied, but his tone suggested he was beginning to doubt his own position. Surely you want your children to grow up understanding appropriate social boundaries. I want my children to grow up understanding that families are built on love, commitment, and mutual support, Marcus replied firmly. I want them to understand that moral behavior means treating people with respect and kindness, not judging them based on narrow prejudices. Thomas stepped forward again, his young face showing a maturity that came from defending everything he held dear. "Inspectors, you keep talking about morality and proper behavior. Let me tell you what I've learned about both from Miss Catherine." He began counting on his fingers as he spoke. "I've learned that moral people keep their promises, even when it's difficult. Miss Catherine promised to take care of our family, and she's kept that promise every single day. I've learned that moral people put others' needs before their own. Comfort. Miss Catherine could have found an easier situation, but she stayed because we needed her." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've learned that moral people stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. Miss Catherine has faced criticism and gossip because of our living situation, but she's never wavered in her commitment to our family. If those aren't moral qualities, then I don't understand what morality means." The other children nodded agreement, their faces showing the same determination that characterized their older brother. Catherine felt her heart swell with pride at the young people she'd helped raise, even as she feared for their future if this investigation went badly. Inspector Whitman closed his notebook with a snap that sounded like a door slamming. "We'll need to see the sleeping arrangements and interview each child individually before we can complete our assessment. The state will make its determination based on our findings and recommendations." As the officials prepared to conduct their formal inspection, Catherine realized that everything she'd built with the Wellington family hung in the balance of the next few hours. The children she'd come to love as her own might be taken away because someone had decided that conventional appearances mattered more than actual well-being. But looking at the united front of the Wellington family, 8 children and 1 man, who had chosen to stand with her against official pressure, Catherine felt her resolve strengthen. They had built something real and valuable together, something worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The battle for their family's survival was just beginning, and Catherine intended to use every weapon at her disposal. The truth about their living situation, the evidence of the children's well-being, and the testimony of community members who had witnessed their transformation. She would not let bureaucratic prejudice destroy the home they had created together. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows as the inspectors began their systematic examination of the Wellington household. Catherine watched them, measure sleeping spaces, count beds, and document every detail that might be used to justify their predetermined conclusions. But she also noticed something else. The children moved through their home with easy confidence, answering questions honestly and without fear. They had nothing to hide because they lived in a house built on love, respect, and genuine care for each other's welfare. Whatever the outcome of this investigation, Catherine realized that she and the Wellington family had already won something more valuable than official approval. They had created a real family, bound together by choice rather than just blood, stronger because of the challenges they'd faced together. The fight for their right to remain together was far from over, but Catherine faced it with the knowledge that she was no longer the worthless woman who had been sold at auction. She was a mother, a protector, and a vital part of something beautiful that no government inspector could truly understand or rightfully destroy. The scream that shattered. The September morning came from the direction of the sawmill, carrying across the Wellington property with the urgency of mortal terror. Catherine dropped the apple she'd been peeling for lunch and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the voice crying for help. It was James, one of the 14-year-old twins, and the raw panic in his shout told her that something catastrophic had happened. She reached the mill clearing to find a scene that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. Jonathan lay pinned beneath a massive oak beam that had broken free from the loading mechanism. His left leg twisted at an angle that made Catherine's stomach lurch with sick recognition. Blood seeped through his torn pants, and his face had gone the waxy white color that spoke of shock and severe internal trauma. James knelt beside his twin brother, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face as he tried desperately to lift the timber that was far too heavy for a 14-year-old boy to move alone. "Help me!" he sobbed when he saw Catherine approaching. "I can't get it off him. Jonathan's hurt really bad, and I can't get him free." Catherine's mind raced through possibilities as she assessed the emergency. The beam had to weigh at least 300 pounds, and Jonathan's position underneath meant that any attempt to move it carelessly could cause additional damage to his already injured leg. But leaving him trapped was also dangerous. She could see that he was losing consciousness from pain and blood loss. "James, listen to me carefully," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the panic clawing at her chest. "I need you to run to the house and get Thomas and Margaret. Tell them to bring the block and tackle from the barn, and have Margaret send Samuel to fetch Dr. Hayes immediately. Can you do that?" James nodded frantically and sprinted toward the farmhouse, his legs pumping with desperate speed. Catherine knelt beside Jonathan, checking his pulse and breathing while trying to determine the extent of his injuries. His leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, but she was more worried about internal injuries that she couldn't see. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" she asked, gently, stroking his sweat-dampened hair away from his forehead. The boy's eyes fluttered, open, unfocused with pain. "Miss Catherine, I can't feel my leg. Why can't I feel my leg?" Catherine's heart clenched with fear, but she kept her voice steady and reassuring. "You're going to be fine, sweetheart. Your leg is hurt, but we're going to get you free, and Dr. Hayes will fix you up. I need you to stay awake and talk to me, all right?" Thomas arrived first, his face going pale when he saw his younger brother trapped beneath the massive beam. Behind him came Margaret, carrying the pulley system from the barn, followed by Anne and Lucy, whose young faces showed the terror of children watching their family face a crisis that might be beyond their ability to handle. "How did this happen?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion as he began setting up the block and tackle system. "We were helping Papa move the big logs to the mill," James explained through his tears. "The rope on the loading crane snapped, and the beam came down before Jonathan could get out of the way. Papa went to town for supplies this morning, and we thought we could handle it ourselves." Catherine felt a chill of recognition as she realized the full implications of the situation. Marcus was gone. Dr. Hayes was at least 30 minutes away, and Jonathan needed immediate medical attention that was beyond her capabilities. But more than that, this accident had occurred at the worst possible time, just 3 days before the state hearing that would determine whether the Wellington children should be removed from their home if Jonathan died or suffered permanent disability while under her supervision. It would provide all the evidence the state inspectors needed to prove that the Wellington household was unsafe for children. The family would be torn apart, and Catherine would bear the responsibility for the tragedy that destroyed everything they'd built together. Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. "Miss Catherine, what do we do? If Jonathan doesn't get proper medical care immediately—" "He'll get proper medical care," Catherine said firmly, her mind racing through everything she'd learned about field medicine during her childhood on a remote farm. "Thomas, position the pulley directly over the beam. Margaret, I need you to gather clean cloth for bandages and boil water for cleaning wounds. Anne, take Lucy and Rose to the house and keep them busy. They don't need to see this." As the older children scrambled to follow her instructions, Catherine knelt beside Jonathan again and began a more thorough assessment of his condition. His breathing was shallow but steady, his pulse was rapid but not weak, and while his leg was definitely broken, she didn't see signs of the massive internal bleeding that would indicate fatal injuries. "Jonathan, I need to examine your leg to see how badly it's hurt," she told him gently. "It's going to be painful, but I have to know what we're dealing with before we move you." The boy nodded weakly, gritting his teeth as Catherine carefully cut away his torn pants to expose the injury. What she found was both better and worse than she'd feared. The break was clean, without bone protruding through the skin, but it was definitely a complete fracture that would require surgical setting to heal properly. More immediately concerning was the bleeding from several deep gashes where the rough timber had scraped against his leg. The wounds needed cleaning and stitching, and they needed it soon, before infection could set in. Thomas had the pulley system in position, with the rope threaded through to provide mechanical advantage for lifting the heavy beam. "Miss Catherine, we're ready to try moving the timber. How do you want to do this?" Catherine studied the situation carefully, understanding that they would have only one chance to do this safely. If they made a mistake, they could cause additional injury to Jonathan or even trap him more securely beneath the fallen beam. "James, I need you to position yourself where you can slide Jonathan away from the timber the moment we lift it high enough," she instructed. "Thomas, you and I will work the pulley together, but we need to lift slowly and steadily. Margaret, you'll guide James and tell us when Jonathan is clear." As they prepared to attempt the rescue, Catherine found herself praying to a God she'd often doubted during her years of hardship. "Please," she thought desperately, "let us save this boy. Don't let my inadequacy destroy this family." The beam rose slowly as Thomas and Catherine worked the pulley system, every inch requiring tremendous effort despite the mechanical advantage. When they'd lifted it just enough to create space, James quickly but carefully pulled his brother free from beneath the timber. Jonathan cried out in pain as his broken leg was moved, but the sound was music to Catherine's ears because it meant he was conscious and responsive. They lowered the beam safely to the ground and immediately turned their attention to treating his injuries. Working with the efficiency born of emergency, Catherine and Margaret cleaned and bandaged Jonathan's wounds, while Thomas rode hard toward town to intercept Dr. Hayes and bring him back immediately. The bleeding was under control, but Catherine knew that the broken bone needed professional setting, and there was always the risk of complications she wasn't qualified to handle. As they worked, Catherine became aware that they weren't alone. Somehow, word of the accident had spread through the community, and neighbors were arriving to offer help. Mrs. Patterson appeared with additional medical supplies and clean bandages. Mr. Henderson brought his wagon to transport Jonathan to Dr. Hayes's office if necessary. Even families that had been cool toward the Wellington household after Mrs. Thornton's campaign showed up ready to assist during the crisis. "How is the boy?" asked Robert Morrison, the mill owner, his face creased with genuine concern. "I heard there was an accident with the loading equipment. His leg is broken, but he's stable," Catherine replied, not taking her eyes off Jonathan as she monitored his condition. "Dr. Hayes should be here soon to provide proper medical treatment." Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, who ran the lending library, knelt beside Catherine with the competence of someone who'd dealt with medical emergencies before. "Miss Catherine, you've done excellent work stabilizing him. That's professional quality field medicine." The arrival of Dr. Hayes brought both relief and renewed anxiety. The elderly physician examined Jonathan thoroughly, his experienced hands checking for signs of complications that Catherine might have missed. His verdict would determine whether she'd handled the emergency correctly or made mistakes that could have fatal consequences. "Miss Catherine," Dr. Hayes said after completing his examination, "your immediate treatment probably saved this boy's leg and possibly his life. The bleeding is well controlled, there's no sign of internal injury, and the fracture, while serious, should heal completely with proper setting." The relief that flooded through Catherine's body was so intense that her knees nearly gave out. Jonathan would recover, the family would remain intact, and she hadn't failed in the most important test of her capabilities. But even as Dr. Hayes began the process of setting Jonathan's broken bone, Catherine realized that this accident would have consequences beyond the immediate medical crisis. Word would reach the state inspectors that a child had been seriously injured while under her supervision. They would use this incident as evidence that the Wellington household was unsafe, regardless of how competently she'd handled the emergency. The thought had barely formed in her mind when she saw a familiar figure riding toward the mill clearing. Inspector Harold Whitman had arrived, drawn by the same community communication network that had brought the neighbors to help. His presence transformed what had been a medical emergency into a potential legal catastrophe. "Miss Morris," Inspector Whitman said as he dismounted from his horse, "I understand there's been an accident involving one of the Wellington children." A serious accident that was handled with remarkable skill, Dr. Hayes interjected before Catherine could respond. Miss Catherine's immediate medical intervention prevented what could have been a fatal outcome. Inspector Whitman pulled out his ever-present notebook and began recording details. "Doctor, with respect, that's not for you to determine. The state's concern is whether this household provides adequate supervision for 8 children. A 14-year-old boy suffering a serious injury suggests that supervision may be insufficient." Margaret stepped forward, her 16-year-old face showing the fierce protectiveness that had become her trademark when defending her family. "Inspector Whitman, with respect, accidents happen even in the most careful households. What matters is how they're handled when they occur, and how was this particular accident handled?" the inspector asked, his pen poised to record potentially damaging testimony. James, who had been quietly holding his twin brother's hand during Dr. Hayes's treatment, looked up with tears still visible on his dirt-stained cheeks. "Miss Catherine saved Jonathan's life," he said simply. "She knew exactly what to do, and she stayed calm when everyone else was scared. If she hadn't been here, my brother would have died." Thomas, who had returned with Dr. Hayes, nodded agreement. "Inspector, Miss Catherine organized the rescue, provided medical treatment, and managed the entire crisis better than most trained emergency personnel could have done. She turned a potential tragedy into a manageable situation." Inspector Whitman continued taking notes, but Catherine could see uncertainty in his expression. The testimony he was hearing didn't match the narrative of inadequate supervision that he'd expected to document. Dr. Hayes completed his work setting Jonathan's leg and looked up at the inspector with professional authority. "Mr. Whitman, I've been practicing medicine for 35 years, and I've seen how different people respond to medical emergencies. Miss Catherine's actions today were those of someone with excellent training, quick thinking, and genuine concern for the patient's welfare. Any hospital would be fortunate to have someone with her skills on their staff." The doctor's endorsement carried weight that even bureaucratic prejudice couldn't easily dismiss. Inspector Whitman closed his notebook with visible reluctance, clearly unhappy that his investigation had uncovered competence rather than the negligence he'd hoped to find. "The state will take Dr. Hayes's assessment into consideration," he said formally. "However, the fact remains that a child was seriously injured while in Miss Morris's care. The hearing scheduled for next week will determine whether this incident affects our evaluation of the household's suitability." As the inspector prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with the quiet authority of a respected community leader. "Mr. Whitman, before you go, I think you should know that Miss Catherine's handling of this emergency has impressed everyone who witnessed it. She demonstrated the kind of medical knowledge and crisis management skills that most communities can only hope for in their caregivers." Other neighbors nodded agreement, their faces showing genuine admiration for Catherine's performance under pressure. What had started as a potential disaster was becoming a testament to her capabilities and value to the Wellington family. Mr. Henderson, who owned the largest farm in the area, spoke up with the confidence of a man whose opinion carried weight in business and community circles. Inspector, I've raised 6 children of my own, and I've seen my share of accidents and emergencies. Miss Catherine handled this crisis better than anyone could reasonably expect. Any family would be fortunate to have someone with her skills and dedication. Jonathan, despite his pain and medication, managed to focus his attention on the inspector. "Sir," he said weakly but clearly, "Miss Catherine didn't cause my accident. She saved me from it. Please don't punish our family because I made a mistake trying to help Papa with work that was too dangerous for kids." The simple honesty of a 14-year-old boy in pain carried more impact than all the adult testimony combined. Inspector Whitman looked uncomfortable as he realized that his investigation was revealing strengths rather than weaknesses in the Wellington household arrangements. As the crowd began to disperse and Jonathan was prepared for transport to Dr. Hayes's office for additional treatment, Catherine found herself surrounded by community members offering support and encouragement. The crisis had revealed something important about her place in their society. She wasn't just tolerated anymore, she was valued. Mrs. Martinez approached with a warm smile. "Miss Catherine, my husband and I want you to know that we'll be speaking in support of your family at the state hearing. What we witnessed today proves that those children couldn't be in better hands." Similar offers of testimony came from other neighbors, creating a groundswell of community support that Catherine hadn't dared to hope for. The accident that could have destroyed her standing had instead demonstrated her value in ways that no amount of argument could have achieved. Marcus arrived as they were loading Jonathan into the wagon for transport to town. His face went white when he saw his son's condition, but the steady stream of reassurance from neighbors and Dr. Hayes's confident prognosis quickly calmed his initial panic. "Catherine," he said quietly, taking her hands in his work-roughened grip, "thank you. Thank you for saving my son." "He's going to be fine," Catherine replied, allowing herself to finally acknowledge the exhaustion that was settling into her bones now that the crisis had passed. "Dr. Hayes says the break will heal completely and there should be no permanent damage." Marcus looked around at the neighbors who had responded to the emergency, then back at Catherine with an expression that held more than gratitude. "You know this changes everything, don't you? After today, no one can question whether you belong with this family." As evening settled over the Wellington farm and Jonathan rested comfortably under Dr. Hayes' continued care, Catherine sat on the front porch reflecting on the day's events. The crisis that could have destroyed everything had instead strengthened the bonds between her and the Wellington family, demonstrated her value to the broader community, and provided powerful testimony for the upcoming state hearing. She understood now that her worth wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others' opinions. It was something she created through her actions, her choices, and her commitment to the people she loved. The woman who had been sold at auction because society deemed her worthless had proven herself indispensable when crisis demanded real competence. The stars were beginning to appear in the Massachusetts sky when Marcus joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual. "Dr. Hayes says Jonathan should make a complete recovery," he reported. "The break was clean and there's no sign of complications." "I was so frightened," Catherine admitted, allowing herself to acknowledge the fear she'd hidden during the emergency. "If I'd made the wrong choice, if I'd moved him incorrectly." "But you didn't," Marcus interrupted gently. "You made exactly the right choices at exactly the right moments. You saved my son's life, Catherine. How can I ever thank you for that?" Catherine looked at this man who had given her a chance when no one else would, who had seen value in her when society saw only failure. "You already have," she said softly. "You gave me a family to love and protect. You gave me a reason to be strong when strength was needed. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Catherine realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The state hearing would proceed as scheduled, and Inspector Whitman would present his findings to officials who would decide the Wellington family's fate. But she faced that prospect with confidence born of tested capability. She had proven herself. Under the most demanding circumstances possible, she had demonstrated skills that saved lives and held families together. She had earned the respect and support of her community through actions rather than words. Whatever the state officials decided about the legality of her living situation, Catherine knew she had become exactly what Marcus had told Inspector Briggs. She was an indispensable member of a family that worked, thrived, and loved each other despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. The fight for their right to remain together wasn't over, but Catherine no longer feared the outcome. She had found her strength, proven her worth, and discovered that families built on choice and commitment could be just as strong as those built on blood and tradition. The hearing would come, but she would face it as Catherine Wellington in all. But name, a woman who had earned her place through competence, courage, and unwavering dedication to the people who mattered most in her life. The courthouse in Springfield, Massachusetts had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the morning of August 15th. What was supposed to be a routine child welfare hearing had transformed into something resembling a community referendum on the nature of family, morality, and worth. Catherine sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the gravity of proceedings that could tear apart everything she'd built with the Wellington family. Behind her, the courtroom gallery buzzed with an unprecedented gathering of supporters. Dr. Benjamin Hayes sat in the front row, his medical bag at his feet, and a thick folder of documentation in his hands. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson occupied the seat beside him, her presence as the mill owner's wife lending social weight to Catherine's defense. The Henderson family had driven 30 miles from their farm to testify about Catherine's character and capabilities, but perhaps most remarkably, Jonathan Wellington sat in a wheelchair near the front of the courtroom, his healing leg extended, in a cast that bore the signatures of dozens of community members who had visited during his recovery. The 14-year-old's presence served as living proof of Catherine's medical competence and crisis management skills. Judge Harrison Blackwood called the hearing to order with the gravitas befitting a man who had spent 20 years deciding the fates of families across western Massachusetts. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for bureaucratic overreach, making him exactly the kind of official Catherine hoped would see through the state's prejudicial accusations. This hearing has been called to evaluate allegations that the living arrangements in the Wellington household constitute an inappropriate environment for minor children, Judge Blackwood announced. Inspector Whitman, please present the state's findings. Inspector Whitman rose from his table with visible reluctance, his earlier confidence clearly shaken by weeks of investigation that had revealed competence rather than negligence. Your Honor, the Department of Public Welfare received complaints that Miss Catherine Morris, an unmarried woman of questionable background, was living in improper cohabitation with widower Marcus Wellington and his 8 minor children. The inspector consulted his notes with the air of a man delivering testimony he no longer fully believed. Our investigation revealed that Miss Morris does indeed reside in the Wellington household, sharing meals and daily life with the family, in a manner that violates conventional standards of moral propriety. Judge Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes focusing on the inspector. Mr. Whitman, has your investigation revealed any evidence of actual moral impropriety? Any indication that the children have been harmed or corrupted by Miss Morris's presence? Inspector Whitman's hesitation spoke volumes. Not in the conventional sense, Your Honor. However, the appearance of impropriety itself constitutes a violation of community standards and potentially harmful influence on impressionable young minds. I see, Judge Blackwood replied dryly. And what specific evidence do you have that this appearance of impropriety has caused actual harm to the Wellington children? Before Inspector Whitman could respond, the courtroom doors opened to admit a figure that sent murmurs of surprise through the gallery. Reverend Samuel Phillips, the stern minister whose congregation included many of the community's most conservative families, walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of a man on a mission. Catherine's heart sank as she recognized the clergyman who had remained notably silent during the community debates about her living situation. If Reverend Phillips testified against her, his moral authority could sway the judge regardless of other evidence in her favor. "Your Honor," Reverend Phillips said as he approached the witness stand, "I request permission to offer testimony relevant to this case." Judge Blackwood nodded his approval. "Reverend Phillips, you're recognized as a witness. Please state your relationship to the parties involved." "I am the pastor of Trinity Presbyterian Church, which the Wellington family has attended for 12 years, Reverend Phillips replied. "I have observed Miss Catherine Morris's influence on this family for the past 8 months, and I believe my testimony is essential for understanding the true nature of her character and impact." Catherine held her breath, certain that the minister's testimony would seal her fate. But Reverend Phillips's next words stunned everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, in 30 years of ministry, I have rarely witnessed such a profound transformation as the one that has occurred in the Wellington household since Miss Morris joined their family. These children, who were struggling with grief and overwhelming responsibilities, have flourished under her care in ways that can only be described as miraculous." The Reverend's voice carried the conviction of a man speaking absolute truth. "I have watched Thomas Wellington develop from a young man burdened by premature responsibilities into a confident student with clear academic goals. I have seen Margaret Wellington transform from an overwhelmed child trying to mother 7 siblings into a poised young woman with her own aspirations and talents." He gestured toward Jonathan in his wheelchair. "When young Jonathan suffered his recent accident, Miss Morris's medical competence and crisis management skills saved his life. Her actions demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom and selfless dedication that our faith teaches as the highest virtues." Reverend Phillips turned to face Judge Blackwood directly. "Your Honor, the question before this court is not whether Miss Morris's living situation conforms to narrow social conventions. The question is whether she provides a moral, nurturing environment that serves the best interests of 8 children who desperately needed someone to care about their welfare." The minister's voice grew stronger as he continued, "I can testify without reservation that Miss Morris has provided exactly that kind of environment. She has taught these children values of honesty, hard work, compassion, and mutual support. She has demonstrated daily that moral behavior consists of actions, not appearances." Inspector Whitman appeared visibly shaken by this unexpected testimony from one of the community's most respected moral authorities. Judge Blackwood made detailed notes as Reverend Phillips continued his surprising defense of Catherine's character and influence. "Furthermore," the Reverend added, "I believe this case represents a dangerous precedent. If we allow bureaucratic prejudices to override evidence of actual child welfare, we risk destroying families that work well simply because they don't conform to arbitrary standards of conventional appearance." As Reverend Phillips stepped down from the witness stand, Dr. Hayes rose to present his medical testimony. The elderly physician carried himself with the authority of someone whose professional opinion had guided countless life-and-death decisions. "Over 3 decades of practice, Your Honor, I have been the Wellington family's physician for 12 years, Dr. Hayes began. I treated Elizabeth Wellington during her final illness, and I have monitored the health and development of all 8 children since Miss Morris joined their household. The doctor opened his thick folder and consulted detailed medical records. The improvements in these children's physical and emotional health since Miss Morris's arrival have been remarkable. Their nutrition has improved dramatically. Their stress-related ailments have virtually disappeared, and their developmental milestones are all within normal or above normal ranges. Dr. Hayes removed several photographs from his folder and approached the judge's bench. These images document the children's condition before and after Miss Morris's arrival. The contrast speaks more eloquently than any words could about the quality of care she provides. Judge Blackwood examined the photographs carefully, his expression revealing surprise at the dramatic differences the images documented. Dr. Hayes, in your professional opinion, what accounts for these improvements? Consistent, competent, loving care, Dr. Hayes replied without hesitation. Miss Morris has created a stable, nurturing environment that addresses both the physical and emotional needs of 8 children who had experienced traumatic loss. Her medical knowledge, demonstrated during Jonathan's recent accident, exceeds that of many trained nurses I've worked with. The physician's voice carried deep conviction as he continued, Your Honor, removing Miss Morris from this household would constitute a form of child abuse. These children have found stability, love, and guidance under her care. Disrupting that relationship would cause psychological trauma that could affect them for the rest of their lives. Inspector Whitman attempted to challenge Dr. Hayes's testimony. Doctor, surely you recognize that there are proper institutional arrangements for orphaned children that don't require unconventional living situations. Dr. Hayes turned to face the inspector with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Whitman, I have visited orphanages and institutional care facilities throughout New England. I can assure you that none of them provide the individualized attention, educational opportunities, and emotional support that these children receive in their current home. The doctor's professional authority lent crushing weight to his words. Furthermore, these children are not orphans. They have a devoted father and a woman who has chosen to dedicate her life to their welfare. Destroying that family structure to satisfy bureaucratic prejudices would be both cruel and counterproductive. As Dr. Hayes returned to his seat, Mrs. Patterson rose to offer testimony that would address the social concerns underlying the state's case. As the wife of the mill owner and unofficial leader of the community's social establishment, her words carried particular weight with officials concerned about moral propriety. Your Honor, I speak today not only as an individual observer, but as a representative of the Women's Auxiliary of Trinity Presbyterian Church and the Springfield County Ladies Charitable Society, Mrs. Patterson began. Our organizations have conducted their own informal evaluation of Miss Morris's influence on the Wellington family and the broader community. She opened a leather portfolio containing letters and documents that represented weeks of careful documentation. We have interviewed neighbors, teachers, merchants, and other families who have interacted with the Wellington household. The unanimous conclusion is that Miss Morris has transformed not only her immediate family, but has become a positive influence throughout our community. Mrs. Patterson consulted her notes as she continued. Miss Morris has provided medical assistance to 6 different families during emergencies. She has tutored children from 4 households in mathematics and reading. She has shared her expertise in food preservation and household management with dozens of women who have benefited from her knowledge. The social leader's voice carried the authority of a woman accustomed to being taken seriously on matters of community welfare. Your Honor, the suggestion that Miss Morris represents a moral threat to our community is not only false, but insulting. to the many families who have witnessed her positive contributions firsthand. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was followed by a parade of community members who had travelled to Springfield specifically to defend Catherine's character and capabilities. Teachers spoke about the academic progress of the Wellington children. Merchants testified about the family's integrity and responsibility. Neighbors described Catherine's helpfulness during emergencies and crises, but perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the banker's wife whose initial complaints had triggered the state investigation, approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance and visible embarrassment. "Your Honor," Mrs. Thornton began, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom, "I must retract the statements I made to state authorities about Miss Morris and the Wellington household." The admission sent gasps of surprise through the gallery. Inspector Whitman looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, realizing that his primary complainant was abandoning the case that justified his investigation. Mrs. Thornton's voice grew stronger as she continued her stunning reversal. "I have observed Miss Morris's actions during several community crises over the past months. Her competence, dedication, and moral character have proven me wrong about the nature of her influence on the Wellington family." The banker's wife straightened her shoulders as she delivered her final blow to the state's case. "Your Honor, I now believe that attempting to remove Miss Morris from the Wellington household would be a grave injustice to 8 children who have found stability and love under her care. I formally request that this investigation be dismissed and that this family be allowed to continue their lives without further bureaucratic interference." The courtroom erupted in applause. The Judge Blackwood had to gavel into silence. Inspector Whitman slumped in his chair, clearly recognizing that his case had collapsed under the weight of overwhelming community testimony in Catherine's favor. But the most moving testimony was yet to come. Judge Blackwood called for the Wellington children themselves to speak about their living situation and their feelings about Catherine's role in their family. Thomas Wellington, now 20 years old and possessing the dignity of a young man who had faced adult responsibilities, stood to address the court with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, Miss Catherine didn't just join our household. She saved our family from falling apart after our mother died." His voice carried the authority of lived experience as he continued, "Before she came to us, I was trying to be a father to 7 younger children while still finishing my own education. Margaret was trying to be a mother at 13 years old. The little ones were scared and confused, not sure if anyone would take care of them." Thomas gestured toward his siblings, who sat in a row behind the defendant's table. "Miss Catherine gave us back our childhood while teaching us to be responsible adults. She helped me pursue engineering studies while ensuring that Margaret could be a teenager instead of a substitute mother. She made the little ones feel safe and loved again." The young man's voice grew stronger as he approached his conclusion. "Your Honor, families aren't just created by blood relationships. They're created by people who choose to love and care for each other. Miss Catherine chose to love us, and we chose to love her back. If that's not a real family, then I don't understand what family means." Margaret Wellington followed her brother to the witness stand, her 16-year-old poise commanding attention from everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, before Miss Catherine joined our family, I thought my childhood was over. I was cooking for 9 people, doing laundry for 9 people, and trying to keep everyone clean, fed, and safe, while Papa worked 16-hour days just to keep our farm running." Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had experienced both hardship and rescue. "Miss Catherine didn't just take over those responsibilities. She taught me how to manage them efficiently while still having time for my own education and interests. She showed me that being strong doesn't mean sacrificing everything for others. It means finding ways for everyone to contribute and support each other." Margaret looked directly at Judge Blackwood as she delivered her most important point. Your Honor, I've learned more about real morality from Miss Catherine than from anyone else in my life. She's taught me that moral behavior means keeping your promises, helping people who need help, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. If those aren't the values we want children to learn, then I don't understand what morality means. The younger children's testimony proved equally compelling. Anne Wellington, at 12 years old, spoke with startling articulation about Catherine's educational influence and emotional support. Samuel described Catherine's patient help with his animal care responsibilities and her encouragement of his natural talents. But it was little Rose Wellington, now 6 years old, whose testimony provided the emotional climax of the hearing. The small girl approached the witness stand with the fearless honesty that only children possess. "Judge Mann," Rose said, her clear voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom, "are you the person who decides if Miss Catherine gets to stay with our family?" Judge Blackwood leaned forward with a gentle smile. "Yes, Rose, that's exactly what I'm trying to decide." Rose nodded seriously, as if she understood the full weight of the decision before the court. "Well, I want you to know that Miss Catherine fixes everything that gets broken. She fixed my doll when stuffing was coming out. She fixed Jonathan's leg when the big log hurt him. And she fixed our family when we were all sad and scared after Mama went to heaven." The little girl's voice grew stronger as she continued with devastating simplicity. "I think fixing broken things is the most important job there is. And Miss Catherine is the best at fixing broken things that I ever saw. So if you make her go away, who's going to fix things when they get broken again?" The silence that followed Rose's testimony was profound and complete. Judge Blackwood wiped his eyes with obvious emotion before calling for a brief recess to consider the overwhelming evidence presented by both sides. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, Judge Blackwood's expression had settled into the confident demeanor of a man who had reached a clear decision about a complex case. After hearing extensive testimony from community members, medical professionals, religious authorities, and the children themselves, Judge Blackwood began, "This court finds that the allegations against Miss Catherine Morris and the Wellington household are without merit." The judge's voice carried absolute authority as he continued his ruling. "The evidence presented demonstrates conclusively that Miss Morris provides exceptional care for the Wellington children, that her presence in their household serves their best interests, and that her influence on both the family and the broader community has been entirely positive." Judge Blackwood looked directly at Inspector Whitman as he delivered his final judgment. "Furthermore, this court finds that the state's investigation was based on prejudicial assumptions rather than evidence of actual harm or impropriety. The Department of Public Welfare is hereby ordered to close this case and to refrain from further harassment of a family that clearly functions well and serves as a positive example for the community." The courtroom erupted in celebration as community members cheered the decision that validated everything Catherine had worked to build with the Wellington family. Children hugged their defender, neighbors congratulated each other on supporting the right cause, and even some court officials smiled at the obvious justice of the outcome. But for Catherine, the greatest validation came from the 8 faces looking at her with love, gratitude, and the absolute certainty that they would never again have to fear losing the woman who had become the heart of their family. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Marcus took Catherine's hand in full view of the entire community. "Miss Catherine Morris," he said with a smile that held more than friendship, "I believe it's time we made some changes to our family's legal status. What would you say to becoming Mrs. Catherine Wellington officially?" Catherine's answer was lost in the cheers of 8 children who had just witnessed their family receive not only legal protection, but social validation that would last for generations. The woman who had been sold at auction because society deemed Her worthless had become the cornerstone of a family that the entire community now recognized as exemplary. The fight for acceptance was over. The battle for belonging had been won, and Catherine Morris Wellington faced a future filled with the love, respect, and security that she had never dared to believe possible. 5 years after the courthouse victory that had validated her place in the Wellington family, Catherine stood in the doorway of her transformed home, watching preparations for what would become the most significant celebration their community had ever hosted. October sunlight streamed through windows that sparkled with the kind of meticulous care that had become her hallmark, illuminating a scene that would have been unimaginable during those dark days when she'd been sold at auction like unwanted livestock. Today marked not just her wedding to Marcus Wellington, but the opening of the Catherine Morris Wellington School for Advanced Learning, the first educational institution in Western Massachusetts specifically designed to serve children from unconventional family situations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered the woman once deemed worthless by society, now having a school named in her honor. "Miss Catherine, the carriage from Boston just arrived," announced Anne Wellington, now 17, and serving as the school's first assistant teacher. Her bright eyes sparkled with excitement as she adjusted the flowers in her hair. "Professor Harrison from Harvard University is here to speak at the dedication ceremony." Catherine smiled at the young woman, who had grown from a curious 12-year-old into a confident educator under her guidance. Anne's transformation symbolized everything Catherine had accomplished, taking natural potential and nurturing it into something extraordinary through patient attention and unwavering belief. Margaret Wellington, soon to be Margaret Sullivan, when she married the young doctor she'd met at the medical college in Springfield, bustled through the kitchen, making final preparations for the feast that would follow the ceremonies. At 21, she had become an accomplished pianist and music teacher, her talents finally given room to flourish once household responsibilities had been properly shared. "The bread is perfect, the roasts are ready, and Mrs. Patterson brought enough desserts to feed half of Massachusetts," Margaret reported, with the organizational efficiency that had made her invaluable in planning today's complex celebration. "Oh, and Thomas sent word from the telegraph office that his engineering professor from Boston will arrive on the 3 o'clock train." Catherine felt a warm surge of pride thinking about Thomas, now 24, and building bridges throughout New England with the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything the Wellington children pursued. His success in engineering school had opened doors for other young people from rural communities who might otherwise never have had such opportunities. The twins, James and Jonathan, now 19 and fully recovered from his childhood accident, had developed the lumber mill into one of the most innovative operations in the region. Their complementary skills, James's artistic woodworking and Jonathan's mathematical precision, had created furniture and architectural elements that were sought after by wealthy families in Boston and New York. Samuel Wellington, at 15, had become the youngest livestock breeding expert in Massachusetts, his natural gift with animals having developed into scientific knowledge that impressed agricultural professors from Yale University. Local farmers traveled hundreds of miles to seek his advice on breeding programs and animal husbandry techniques. Lucy Wellington, now 10 years old, had inherited Catherine's gift for languages and was already tutoring immigrant children in English, while learning French and German from traveling scholars who stopped at their increasingly famous household. Her quick wit and natural empathy made her a bridge between different communities in ways that impressed adults twice her age. And Rose Wellington, the shy 5-year-old who had once whispered her questions, had blossomed into an 11-year-old, with an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. Her detailed sketches of local flora and fauna had caught the attention of botanists at Harvard, who predicted she might become one of the first women admitted to their advanced science programs. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was visible in Marcus himself. The man who had once worked 16-hour days just to keep his family from falling apart had become a respected leader in educational reform, serving on committees that advised state officials about innovative approaches to childhood development. "And family support, Catherine," Marcus said, appearing beside her with the quiet strength that had first attracted her to him 5 years ago. "Are you ready for this? Once we make our vows public, there'll be no hiding from the attention anymore." Catherine understood what he meant. Their story had become something of a legend throughout New England, inspiring other communities to reconsider their assumptions about family structures and women's capabilities. Newspapers had written articles about the Wellington miracle, and social reformers cited their household as evidence that love and commitment mattered more than conventional arrangements. "I stopped hiding the day I decided to stay and fight for this family," Catherine replied, straightening the simple but elegant wedding dress that Margaret had sewn from fabric purchased with money earned from selling her own needlework designs. "Today, we're not just celebrating our marriage. We're celebrating proof that worthless people don't exist, only people whose worth hasn't been recognized yet." The ceremony took place in the meadow, behind their house, with Reverend Phillips officiating before a gathering that included representatives from universities, government officials who had once tried to separate their family, and neighbors who had witnessed their journey from scandal to celebration. Dr. Hayes served as Marcus's best man, while the 8 Wellington children stood as Catherine's wedding party, symbolizing the family bonds that had made this day possible. As Catherine spoke her vows, she looked out at faces that told the story of her complete transformation, from unwanted burden to cherished cornerstone. Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the frightened woman who had once needed defense against community prejudice. Mrs. Thornton, now one of Catherine's closest friends and strongest supporters, beamed with the satisfaction of someone who had learned to admit her mistakes and celebrate others' success. But the most meaningful moment came when Judge Blackwood, who had traveled from Springfield specifically for the ceremony, rose to offer remarks that would be quoted in newspapers throughout New England for years to come. "5 years ago, I had the privilege of presiding over a hearing that challenged our community to examine the difference between appearance and reality, between prejudice and truth." Judge Blackwood began, his authoritative voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "Today, we celebrate not just a marriage, but a victory for every person who has ever been dismissed, discarded, or deemed worthless by those who couldn't see their true value." The judge gestured toward the newly married couple and their children. "The Wellington family represents something revolutionary in American society, proof that families built on choice, commitment, and love can be just as strong, just as moral, and just as valuable as those built on blood relation and social convention." His words carried the weight of legal authority as he continued. "More importantly, Catherine Wellington represents something that should inspire every community in our nation. She demonstrates that a person's worth isn't determined by their age, their marital status, their ability to bear children, or their conformity to social expectations. A person's worth is determined by their character, their capabilities, and their commitment to the welfare of others." Judge Blackwood's conclusion brought the entire gathering to its feet in spontaneous applause. Catherine Morris arrived in our community as someone society had thrown away. Catherine Wellington stands before us today as someone any community would be fortunate to claim. That transformation didn't happen because she changed who she was. It happened because she finally found people wise enough to see who she had always been. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted well into the evening, with music provided by Margaret and her fellow students from the Music Conservatory, food prepared by dozens of community members who considered contributing to the feast, an honor, and conversations that ranged from the practical matters of education and agriculture to the philosophical questions of family, worth, and social progress. Professor Harrison from Harvard delivered a formal address about the innovative educational approaches being pioneered at the new school, but his most memorable comments were personal reflections on the family that had inspired the institution. "I have observed many experimental educational environments," Professor Harrison told the assembled crowd, "but never have I seen such clear evidence that children thrive when they are valued for their individual gifts rather than forced into conventional molds." The Wellington children represent 8 different paths to success, all nurtured by someone who understood that diversity of talent requires diversity of encouragement. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Catherine found herself standing once again in the doorway of her home, but this time surrounded by a family that bore her name and a community that celebrated her presence. The contrast with that terrifying morning when she'd stood on an auction platform, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder, was so complete that it sometimes felt like remembering someone else's life. Thomas approached with a telegram that had arrived during the celebration. "Catherine, this came from the State Department of Education. They're asking if you'd be willing to serve on a committee developing new standards for child welfare evaluations." Catherine smiled at the irony of being asked to help reform the same system that had once tried to destroy her family. "Tell them I'll consider it, but only if they're serious about putting children's actual welfare ahead of bureaucratic prejudices." Margaret joined them carrying baby Ellen, her first child, born just 3 months earlier, to the delight of grandparents Marcus and Catherine. "Aunt Catherine," Ellen smiled when I told her about the school that bears your name. "I think she's going to be proud of her family's legacy." The word legacy resonated deeply with Catherine as she looked around at the life she'd built from the ashes of society's rejection. Her legacy wasn't just the school, or the successful children, or the reformed attitudes about family structures. Her legacy was the proof that every person has value, that worth isn't something others give or take away, but something that exists inherently in every human being, regardless of their circumstances. Jonathan, fully recovered from his childhood accident and now a skilled craftsman, presented Catherine with a wooden plaque he'd carved for the occasion. The inscription read, "Catherine Morris Wellington, teacher, healer, mother, pioneer, proof that worth isn't determined by others' recognition, but by one's own choices and commitments." As the last guests departed and the family gathered for their traditional evening coffee on the front porch, Catherine reflected on the complete transformation of her life and identity. The woman who had once believed herself broken and useless had become someone whose influence extended far beyond her immediate family to touch entire communities and social movements. Samuel, now pursuing advanced studies in agricultural science, raised his coffee cup in a toast to Catherine, who taught us that families aren't just born, they're built by people brave enough to choose love over convention. Lucy, whose facility with languages had earned her correspondence with scholars across Europe, added her own tribute to the woman who proved that being different isn't the same as being wrong. Rose, whose scientific curiosity had already attracted attention from university professors, offered the most profound observation of all. To Catherine, who showed us that the most important discoveries happen when we look past what we expect, to see and notice what's actually there. As the stars appeared over the Massachusetts hills that had sheltered her transformation, Catherine realized that her journey from worthless to invaluable had become more than a personal triumph. It had become a story that challenged every community to examine their assumptions about human worth and social value. Marcus took her hand as they sat together, surrounded by their children and looking out at land that now hosted educational innovations studied by scholars throughout New England. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your aunt hadn't sold you at that auction?" he asked. Catherine considered the question seriously before answering. "I used to wonder about that, but not anymore. Everything that happened, the rejection, the humiliation, the desperate circumstances, all of it was necessary to bring me here, to this family, to this life where I could discover what I was really capable of becoming." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had anchored their family through every challenge. "I'm grateful for the pain, because it led me to joy. I'm grateful for being thrown away because it taught me to value what's real. And I'm grateful for being deemed worthless because it motivated me to prove that worth comes from what we give, not what others think we're worth." The conversation gradually quieted as the children headed to bed, each of them stopping to embrace. Catherine, with the unconscious affection that characterized families built on genuine love rather than mere obligation. Soon only Catherine and Marcus remained on the porch, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who had built something beautiful together against impossible odds. "Mrs. Catherine Wellington," Marcus said softly, using her new legal name for the first time, "thank you for choosing us. Thank you for staying when it would have been easier to leave. Thank you for showing all of us what real worth looks like." Catherine smiled, thinking of the scared woman who had once stood on an auction platform, convinced that her life was ending. That woman couldn't have imagined the joy, the purpose, the profound sense of belonging that waited on the other side of society's rejection. "Thank you for seeing something worth choosing," she replied. "Thank you for giving me the chance to discover who I really was beneath all the labels others had put on me." As they prepared to go inside to begin their first night as officially married partners, Catherine paused for one last look at the home they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, students to teach, innovations to develop, social barriers to overcome. But tonight, she was simply Catherine Wellington, surrounded by a family that loved her, not despite her unconventional path to their door, but because of the strength and wisdom that path had given her. The woman who had been sold because society deemed her worthless had become priceless to everyone who truly knew her. And in that transformation, she had proven the most important truth of all, that every person has inherent worth waiting to be discovered, nurtured, and celebrated by those wise enough to look beyond surface appearances to the infinite potential that lies within every human heart. The stars over Massachusetts bore witness to a love story that had become a revolution, a family that had become a movement, and a woman whose journey from rejection to acceptance had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone privileged to witness the power of recognition, respect, and unconditional love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 5 years ago, I had the privilege of presiding over a hearing that challenged our community to examine the difference between appearance and reality, between prejudice and truth. Judge Blackwood began, his authoritative voice carrying clearly. "Across the meadow, today we celebrate not just a marriage, but a victory for every person who has ever been dismissed, discarded, or deemed worthless by those who couldn't see their true value." The judge gestured toward the newly married couple and their children. The Wellington family represents something revolutionary in American society. Proof that families built on choice, commitment, and love can be just as strong, just as moral, and just as valuable as those built on blood relation and social convention. His words carried the weight of legal authority as he continued. More importantly, Catherine Wellington represents something that should inspire every community in our nation. She demonstrates that a person's worth isn't determined by their age, their marital status, their ability to bear children, or their conformity to social expectations. A person's worth is determined by their character, their capabilities, and their commitment to the welfare of others. Judge Blackwood's conclusion brought the entire gathering to its feet in spontaneous applause. Catherine Morris arrived in our community as someone society had thrown away. Catherine Wellington stands before us today as someone any community would be fortunate to claim. That transformation didn't happen because she changed who she was. It happened because she finally found people wise enough to see who she had always been. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted well into the evening, with music provided by Margaret and her fellow students from the Music Conservatory, food prepared by dozens of community members who considered contributing to the feast, an honor and conversations that ranged from the practical matters of education and agriculture to the philosophical questions of family, worth, and social progress. Professor Harrison from Harvard delivered a formal address about the innovative educational approaches being pioneered at the new school, but his most memorable comments were personal reflections on the family that had inspired the institution. I have observed many experimental educational environments, Professor Harrison told the assembled crowd, but never have I seen such clear evidence that children thrive when they are valued for their individual gifts, rather than forced into conventional molds. The Wellington children represent 8 different paths to success, all nurtured by someone who understood that diversity of talent requires diversity of encouragement. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Catherine found herself standing once again in the doorway of her home, but this time surrounded by a family that bore her name and a community that celebrated her presence. The contrast with that terrifying morning when she'd stood on an auction platform waiting to be sold to the highest bidder was so complete that it sometimes felt like remembering someone else's life. Thomas approached with a telegram that had arrived during the celebration. Catherine, this came from the State Department of Education. They're asking if you'd be willing to serve on a committee developing new standards for child welfare evaluations. Catherine smiled at the irony of being asked to help reform the same system that had once tried to destroy her family. Tell them I'll consider it, but only if they're serious about putting children's actual welfare ahead of bureaucratic prejudices. Margaret joined them, carrying baby Ellen, her first child, born just 3 months earlier to the delight of grandparents Marcus and Catherine. Aunt Catherine, Ellen smiled when I told her about the school that bears your name. I think she's going to be proud of her family's legacy. The word legacy resonated deeply with Catherine as she looked around at the life she'd built from the ashes of society's rejection. Her legacy wasn't just the school or the successful children or the reformed attitudes about family structures. Her legacy was the proof that every person has value, that worth isn't something others give or take away, but something that exists inherently in every human being regardless of their circumstances. Jonathan, fully recovered from his childhood accident and now a skilled craftsman, presented Catherine with a wooden plaque he'd carved for the occasion. The inscription read, "Catherine Morris Wellington, teacher, healer, mother, pioneer, proof that worth isn't determined by others' recognition, but by one's own choices and commitments." As the last guest departed and the family gathered for their traditional evening coffee on the front porch, Catherine reflected on the complete transformation of her life and identity. The woman who had once believed herself broken and useless had become someone whose influence extended far beyond her immediate family to touch entire communities and social movements. Samuel, now pursuing advanced studies in agricultural science, raised his coffee cup in a toast to Catherine, who taught us that families aren't just born, they're built by people brave enough to choose love over convention. Lucy, whose facility with languages had earned her correspondence with scholars across Europe, added her own tribute to the woman who proved that being different isn't the same as being wrong. Rose, whose scientific curiosity had already attracted attention from university professors, offered the most profound observation of all. To Catherine, who showed us that the most important discoveries happen when we look past what we expect, to see and notice what's actually there. As the stars appeared over the Massachusetts hills that had sheltered her transformation, Catherine realized that her journey from worthless to invaluable had become more than a personal triumph. It had become a story that challenged every community to examine their assumptions about human worth and social value. Marcus took her hand as they sat together, surrounded by their children, and looking out at land that now hosted educational innovations studied by scholars throughout New England. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your aunt hadn't sold you at that auction?" he asked. Catherine considered the question seriously before answering. "I used to wonder about that, but not anymore. Everything that happened, the rejection, the humiliation, the desperate circumstances, all of it was necessary to bring me here, to this family, to this life where I could discover what I was really capable of becoming." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had anchored their family through every challenge. "I'm grateful for the pain because it led me to joy. I'm grateful for being thrown away because it taught me to value what's real. And I'm grateful for being deemed worthless because it motivated me to prove that worth comes from what we give, not what others think we're worth." The conversation gradually quieted as the children headed to bed, each of them stopping to embrace. Catherine, with the unconscious affection that characterized families built on genuine love rather than mere obligation. Soon only Catherine and Marcus remained on the porch, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who had built something beautiful together against impossible odds. "Mrs. Catherine Wellington," Marcus said softly, using her new legal name for the first time. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for staying when it would have been easier to leave. Thank you for showing all of us what real worth looks like." Catherine smiled, thinking of the scared woman who had once stood on an auction platform convinced that her life was ending. That woman couldn't have imagined the joy, the purpose, the profound sense of belonging that waited on the other side of society's rejection. "Thank you for seeing something worth choosing," she replied. "Thank you for giving me the chance to discover who I really was beneath all the labels others had put on me." As they prepared to go inside to begin their first night as officially married partners, Catherine paused for one last look at the home they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, students to teach, innovations to develop, social barriers to overcome. But tonight she was simply Catherine Wellington, surrounded by a family that loved her, not despite her unconventional path to their door, but because of the strength and wisdom that path had given her. The woman who had been sold because society deemed her worthless had become priceless to everyone who truly knew her. And in that transformation, she had proven the most important truth of all, that every person has inherent worth waiting to be discovered, nurtured, and celebrated by those wise enough to look beyond surface appearances to the infinite potential that lies within every human heart. The stars over Massachusetts bore witness to a love story that had become a revolution, a family that had become a movement, and a woman whose journey from rejection to acceptance had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone privileged to witness the power of recognition, respect, and unconditional love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.